The local headline had screamed online, and now Briar Hollow had come to watch with the kind of hungry curiosity people pretend is concern. The courthouse smelled of lemon oil and old paper, and the air felt too warm for December, as if the building itself was nervous. Every bench was packed. Shop owners in work boots, teachers with tight smiles, a few reporters clutching notepads like shields. And all of them kept stealing glances at the same impossible picture. A veteran police K-9 sitting calmly between a little girl and the judge, exactly like the title promised. The girl was small enough that her feet didn't touch the floor from the witness chair, and she wore a blue sweater that looked borrowed, sleeves slightly too long, as if someone had tried to wrap her in extra protection. Her hands were folded in her lap, knuckles pale, chin lifted in a brave, practiced way that made something ache in the room. Beside her stood the handler, Officer Mason Shaw, broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed, the kind of man who didn't waste words because he'd learned words don't stop certain kinds of danger. He had asked the court's permission for the dog to remain close for the child's comfort, and the judge had granted it with a nod that suggested compassion or convenience, or both. The K-9, Ranger, was a dark, disciplined silhouette against the polished floorboards, sitting with military precision, body angled so that if anything moved toward the girl, it would have to move through him first. At first, the crowd treated it like a soft human interest moment, whispering about how sweet it was, how gentle the dog looked, how nice it was that the court allowed something like that. But Shaw didn't smile, and Ranger didn't look sweet. Ranger looked alert in the quiet way a storm looks alert before it breaks. Judge Harold Wexler leaned forward, spectacles low on his nose, voice practiced and calm. "We will proceed with the witness testimony," he said, tapping his pen once. Sharp, crisp, final. The prosecutor rose with careful gentleness. The defense attorney adjusted his tie with an easy confidence that made a few people glance away, and the bailiff's call for silence settled over the room like a blanket. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said, soft as possible. The girl drew in a breath, small, shaky, and opened her mouth. And that's when Ranger changed. Not with barking, not with lunging, just a precise shift, like a switch flipped inside him. Ears forward, muscles tightening under his coat, tail going perfectly still. His nose lifted, and he sampled the air as if the courtroom itself had started leaking a secret. The gallery noticed in a ripple, heads tilting, shoulders stiffening, because everyone in that room understood instinct, even if they pretended they didn't. Shaw's hand hovered near Ranger's harness without touching it, his posture turning subtly to steel. Ranger's eyes slid past the bench, past the seal on the wall, toward the right side rail where a cluster of men in suits sat too close together, faces arranged into polite masks. One of them stopped tapping his foot. Another's smile faltered by a millimeter. The prosecutor paused mid-question, confused by the sudden tension. Judge Wexler began to speak, then stopped mid-sentence, pen frozen between his fingers. His gaze dropped to the dog, then snapped to Shaw, then followed Ranger's stare toward that tight knot of suits. In that suspended second, the courtroom's warmth drained away, and the silence became physical, pressing against throats and ribs. You could hear the building settle. You could hear someone swallow. And then Judge Wexler's face changed, color slipping, certainty cracking, because he saw what Ranger saw, and he realized the danger in his courtroom wasn't coming from the witness stand at all. 2 days earlier, Briar Hollow had looked like a place where secrets couldn't survive, because everything was always out in the open. Sunlight poured down Main Street like honey, catching on storefront glass and turning it into glitter. And the town's winter decorations were so cheerful, they felt like a dare. A red and green banner hung above the bakery window, home for the holidays. While inside, cinnamon and warm sugar drifted out each time the bell chimed, wrapping passers-by in comfort before they even stepped through the door. People waved from porches. They said "mornin'" with easy smiles. They asked about your mama and meant it, at least on the surface. In Briar Hollow, friendliness wasn't just a habit. It was camouflage. The town had a way of smoothing its own edges, sanding down anything sharp until it could be called unfortunate and filed away. Even the courthouse on the hill looked quaint in the daylight, more like a museum than a place where lives got broken. That morning, Ellie Carson walked the sidewalk beside her grandmother, her small hand tucked inside an older one that trembled just slightly, not from age, but from the strain of holding it together. Ellie wore a blue sweater that had once belonged to a cousin, soft, a little faded, sleeves long enough to swallow her wrists, and her hair was neatly brushed back as if order could keep fear from spilling out. She didn't chatter like most kids her age. She watched. She listened. Her eyes moved from face to face with a quiet seriousness that made adults lower their voices without knowing why. At the corner by the florist, Mrs. Denton stepped out with a bucket of pine boughs and saw them. "Well, aren't you two just precious?" she sang, smile bright as a postcard. Then her gaze flicked, fast, guilty, to the sheriff's office across the street, and her smile tightened. "You be safe now," she added, too quickly, as if safety was something you could hand someone like change. Ellie's grandmother murmured thanks and kept walking. They passed the hardware store where two men leaned against the railing drinking coffee. One of them nodded at Ellie, then looked away, like looking too long might mark him. The other muttered something under his breath, and Ellie heard just enough to catch the shape of it. Poor thing. Shouldn't have said anything. Why stir it up? The words slid under her skin like cold water. But she kept her chin lifted because her grandmother had told her over and over, "We don't shrink, Ellie. Not for anyone." It was a brave rule for a town that rewarded shrinking. At the diner, the bell over the door chimed as they stepped inside, and a dozen conversations softened at once, not stopping, but thinning like fog. The waitress, Lila, brought hot chocolate without being asked, setting it down in front of Ellie with a careful tenderness. "On the house," she whispered, eyes glossy. Ellie nodded, dignified, and wrapped her hands around the mug. It warmed her palms, but it didn't warm the air. In the booth behind them, a man in a suit spoke low into his phone, the words muffled, but Ellie caught the tone, smooth, annoyed, certain. "We can't let this go to trial," he said, as if trial was a weather event you could reschedule. Her grandmother's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn. She stared at the menu like it held answers. Later, outside, the town's Christmas lights blinked cheerfully, even in daylight, and children laughed near the gazebo. And for a second, Ellie almost believed the town's story about itself. Nothing bad happens here. Then she saw the poster taped to the community board, "Court date confirmed," and beneath it, a smaller flyer that looked like it had been torn down and taped back up. "Support our local business leaders." The smiling face on that flyer wasn't a stranger. Ellie's stomach tightened, and her throat went dry. She was going to testify against someone the town had decided to protect, someone people called a pillar, someone who shook hands at church and donated turkeys in November. Everyone in Briar Hollow smiled too easily, because they were practicing. Because if you smiled hard enough, maybe you could pretend you didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the fear, didn't know that one brave little girl was about to walk into a courtroom and say the words everyone else refused to say out loud. The day Ellie spoke up, The Briar Hollow Community Hall smelled like potluck casseroles and pine cleaner, and the whole building hummed with the forced cheer of a family night that everyone treated like a mandatory performance. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, the kind cut by careful hands, and the stage had been draped with a banner that read, "Winter Showcase." Because in this town, even children's events were opportunities for certain people to be seen. Parents crowded folding chairs, phones raised, laughing too loud. Teachers moved like stage managers, herding kids into lines, smoothing collars, whispering last-second reminders. Ellie stood with her class near the side curtain, blue sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, watching the room the way you watch ice you don't trust. She wasn't nervous about the singing. She'd practiced at home with her grandmother, soft voice steady, and she knew the words. What made her chest tight was the way people's eyes slid around when a particular man entered, the way conversations dipped and then restarted like a record skipping. Mr. Carden Vale, Town Development Director, Community Benefactor, the one who always seemed to be holding a microphone or cutting a ribbon, walked in with a grin that flashed white under the fluorescent lights. His suit looked expensive in a room of denim and winter coats, and he moved like he owned the floor beneath him. He shook hands with the principal, patted the mayor on the shoulder, waved at the camera of the local paper, and people smiled back because they'd learned that smiling was easier than refusing. Ellie saw him before he saw her, and that mattered, because she caught the small details adults missed. How his eyes didn't soften when he smiled, how he scanned the room like he was counting exits, how he paused just a fraction too long when he looked toward the curtain where the children waited. When the MC called for a special thank you to Mr. Vale for his generous support, applause rose like a reflex. Vale stepped onto the edge of the stage, accepted the praise with a practiced chuckle, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he walked toward the children's line to encourage them before their performance. A teacher, Ms. Rowe, shifted to intercept, smile fixed. But Vale lifted a hand like he was brushing away a fly. "It's fine," he said, tone warm enough to sound harmless, and Ms. Rowe stopped anyway. That was the first freeze, the first small surrender. Vale crouched beside a boy and adjusted his scarf without being asked. He complimented a girl's hair bow. He joked with a parent loud enough for people to laugh. Then his hand landed on Ellie's shoulder. Not a light tap, a hold. He leaned in close, too close, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "You're Ellie Carson, right?" he murmured. And when she didn't answer immediately, his fingers tightened in a way that made her skin prickle. "Such a serious little thing," he added, smiling up at the adults like he was being charming, like this was wholesome. Ellie's stomach turned. She tried to step sideways, but his grip followed. "Don't be shy," he whispered, and the words sounded friendly until you felt the weight behind them. Around them, the room kept smiling. Phones kept recording. People watched and did nothing, because doing nothing was the town's most practiced skill. Ellie's eyes flicked to Ms. Rowe, who looked trapped between fear and responsibility, and then to the principal, who had turned his head as if he suddenly needed to check the sound system. Ellie felt the moment stretch, thin and terrible, and she understood something that kids shouldn't have to understand. If she stayed quiet, this would be allowed to become normal. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might shake the paper snowflakes down. Then, with a breath that tasted like metal, Ellie lifted her chin and pulled her shoulder free with a quick twist. The movement was small, but it was decisive, like a door clicking shut. Vale's smile didn't move, but his eyes sharpened. "Careful," he murmured, still soft. Ellie didn't back up. She didn't look away. Her voice came out thin at first, then steadier, cutting through the sugary noise of the hall like a clean blade. "Don't touch me," she said. The nearest parents blinked, startled, laughter dying in their throats. Ellie swallowed once, hands shaking inside her sleeves, and said louder, clear enough for everyone to hear. "He keeps grabbing me. He did it before. He told me not to tell." The room went silent in a way that felt violent, like all the air had been yanked out at once. Someone's phone lowered. A chair creaked. Vale's hand hovered midair, then dropped slowly, as if he were deciding whether to laugh. He did laugh. A short sound that tried to turn the moment into a misunderstanding. "Whoa there," he said, voice bright, performing innocence for the crowd. "Kids say the darndest things." But Ellie didn't laugh. She stared at him with a calm that didn't belong to her age, and the adults around them went stiff, eyes darting to each other, to Vale, to the exits, as if the truth Ellie had spoken had changed the rules of the room. And in that frozen second, before anyone could rush in to smooth it over, Vale's smile slipped just enough to show what was underneath: irritation, calculation, a threat that didn't need words. Ellie had named what happened. The town had heard it. And the danger, the real danger, began the instant Vale realized she wasn't going to be quiet anymore. By the time Officer Mason Shaw arrived at the community hall, the parking lot had that strange, brittle stillness that follows a public scene everyone pretends didn't happen. Headlights sweeping across faces that refused to meet each other. Parents loading kids into cars too fast. The fluorescent lights inside buzzing like an exposed nerve. Shaw didn't come in with sirens or swagger. He came in the way a seasoned man enters trouble, quietly. Eyes already reading angles. Shoulders relaxed, but ready. Ranger patted at his left knee on a short blade, nails clicking softly on the tile. Body controlled and purposeful, as if he understood the stakes before anyone explained them. Shaw's uniform was neat, but worn in small places that told a story. Frayed stitching at the cuff, a faint scar at his jawline, the kind of wear that comes from years of doing hard work without making speeches about it. People noticed him anyway. They always did. Not because he demanded attention, but because he carried a steady gravity. And gravity changes how everyone else stands. "Officer Shaw," the principal said, stepping forward with a smile that didn't quite land, voice too bright. This was all a misunderstanding. Shaw didn't answer the word misunderstanding. He answered the room. His gaze moved over the stage, the line of children now scattered and confused, the teachers clustering like they were trying to form a shield out of bodies and hope. He saw Ellie near the curtain with her grandmother's arm around her shoulders, the blue sweater sleeves bunched in her fists, as if she could hold herself together by gripping fabric. Ellie's face was pale, but her eyes were steady, and Shaw felt the familiar, controlled heat of protectiveness rise in his chest, the kind that didn't explode. It focused. Ranger's head turned the moment Ellie came into view. Not excited, not playful, just attentive, like a professional acknowledging the person he was here to keep safe. Shaw crouched slightly so his voice would meet Ellie's at her level, and he didn't crowd her space. "Hey," he said, low and even. "I'm Mason. This is Ranger. You're not in trouble." Ellie's throat bobbed as she swallowed, and she nodded once, a small motion that looked like courage trying to stay upright. Her grandmother tried to speak, something like "thank you," something like "please." But the words tangled. Shaw lifted a hand, palm open, a quiet signal. "I've got this." Then he stood, and the room felt the difference the way you feel weather change before rain. "I need to know exactly what happened," he said. Not loud, but it carried. People shifted. Ms. Rowe glanced toward the principal. The principal glanced toward the side door. Somewhere near the front row, a man cleared his throat as if he could clear the truth out with it. "Officer, we're handling it internally," the principal started, and Shaw's eyes met his, with calm that had edges. "No," Shaw said simply. "You're not." That single word cracked the town's practiced smile, and for a second everyone had to decide whether they were going to keep playing along. Ranger's nose lifted, drawing in the air like he was reading a book no one else could see. He moved one step forward without being cued, then stopped, body angled toward the cluster of adults near the stage steps. And that was when Shaw noticed the subtle thing that mattered. Ranger wasn't tracking Ellie's fear. He was tracking something else. Something on the edge of the room where Carden Vale stood with two men in suits, laughing too easily, talking too softly. Vale's smile was back in place, polished for the audience, but his gaze kept cutting toward Ellie like a blade testing its sharpness. Ranger stared at him, unblinking, ears pricked, tail still, the stillness of a warning light. Vale's laugh hitched when he noticed. "Beautiful dog," he said, taking a step as if to close distance the way he always did, the way he believed he could. Ranger didn't growl. He didn't need to. His posture tightened, and the line of his body said one clear thing: not one more step. Shaw shortened the lead by an inch, barely visible, but deliberate, and his voice turned procedural, coldly polite. "Sir, please remain where you are," he said, as if Vale were just any citizen, not a town favorite. Vale's eyes narrowed for a blink, then widened into charm again. "Of course, officer," he replied, and the words were sweet, but the air around them tasted like threat. Shaw looked back to Ellie, then to her grandmother, then to Ms. Rowe, and he made a decision with the speed of someone who'd learned hesitation costs people. "We're leaving," he said. "Now. And you're going to tell me everything from the start." Ellie nodded, and as Shaw guided them toward the exit, Ranger stayed between Ellie and the room. Not by accident, not by sentiment, but by instinct trained into duty. Behind them, conversation restarted in fragile whispers, the town's smile trying to stitch itself back together. But Shaw didn't miss what Ranger had shown him. The danger wasn't just one man's hands. It was the way the room protected him. And Ranger's quiet focus on Vale told Shaw this wasn't going to be a simple report, a simple apology, a simple, "we'll handle it." This was a system. And systems don't like little girls who tell the truth. By morning, the town had already started sanding the story down into something it could live with. And Mason Shaw could feel it the moment he stepped into the sheriff's office. The air smelled like stale coffee and polished wood, and every greeting carried that small town sweetness that meant, "Please don't make this hard for us." Sheriff Dale Haskins came out of his back office with a folksy grin, belly pushing against his belt, handshake firm in a way that tried to settle things without saying so. "Mason," he said, drawing the name out like they were old friends sharing a misunderstanding. "Heard you had yourself a little excitement at the community hall." Shaw didn't smile back. Ranger sat at heel, eyes moving, tracking the room's edges the way a professional tracks exits, and Shaw watched Haskins watch the dog like it made him uneasy. "It wasn't excitement," Shaw said. "It was an allegation from a minor. Public place. Multiple potential witnesses. I need the incident documented properly. Recorded statements today and immediate safeguards for the child." Haskins waved a hand like he was shooing a fly. "Now hold on," he chuckled, lowering his voice into that confidential tone men use when they're about to ask you to compromise yourself. We don't want to ruin a good man's life over a kid getting spooked. Carden Vale's done more for this town than anyone. You know that." The words landed like a slap dressed up as advice. Shaw's jaw tightened, and he felt the familiar switch inside him. The mission mode calm that came when other people tried to bury danger under friendliness. "This isn't about his reputation," Shaw said, measured. "It's about her safety." Haskins leaned back in his chair, smile still glued on, eyes sharpening. "We'll talk to him," he promised. "The way you promise a child you'll talk to the monster under the bed. Give him a chance to clear things up. No need to set the whole town on fire." Shaw slid a notepad onto the desk, already filled with times, names, and details from Ellie's statement the night before. "I'm filing this as a formal report," he said, "and I want a copy stamped and logged." Haskins glanced at the paper like it was something dirty, then reached for it slowly. Sure, he murmured. But his gaze flicked toward the open doorway where a deputy hovered, pretending not to listen. "Clerk'll take care of it." Shaw didn't miss the pass, the way Haskins handed it off like he was passing a problem to be dissolved. Shaw followed it to the front counter where the records clerk, a woman with tired eyes, accepted it with a sigh that looked more like fear than annoyance. She stamped something, slid a form toward Shaw, then hesitated. "We're out of the carbon copies," she said quietly. "Printer's acting up." Shaw stared at her until she dropped her eyes. Ranger's head turned toward the back hallway, ears pricking, as if he'd heard something change behind a closed door. Shaw stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "Ma'am," he said, "I need a case number." The clerk swallowed. "Sheriff said it can wait." Shaw's patience didn't break. It hardened. He walked past the counter without asking permission and stopped outside Haskins's office, where voices leaked through the thin wall. Haskins and someone else, tone urgent, the words clipped. "Keep it contained," Haskins was saying. "Don't need outside eyes." Shaw knocked once and entered anyway. The second voice stopped. County Prosecutor Marin Lott stood near the file cabinet, coat still on, smile tight as wire. "Officer Shaw," she said brightly, "we were just discussing procedure." Shaw looked from her to Haskins. "Great," he replied. "Then you'll both agree. We get a forensic interview scheduled. We request the hall's security footage, we separate the child from any contact, and we notify state investigators due to conflict risk." Lott's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Conflict risk?" she echoed, as if the phrase itself was impolite. Haskins chuckled again, trying to make Shaw feel dramatic. "Son," he said, "you're not from some big city. This is Briar Hollow. We handle our own. We don't drag state people in because a little girl got her feelings hurt." Shaw felt heat rise, but he kept it controlled. "She didn't say her feeling were hurt," he answered. "She said he grabbed her and warned her not to tell. That's not feelings. That's a pattern." Lott stepped closer, voice lowering into something almost kind. "Mason," she said, "be reasonable. Trials ruin families. Accusations spread. Are you sure you want to put a child through that? Are you sure you want to make her the face of a scandal?" It was the oldest trick. Wrap pressure in concern. Pretend you're protecting the victim while you protect the predator. Shaw's eyes went cold. "I'm sure I want her protected," he said, "and I'm sure I want the truth preserved." He turned toward the file cabinet, reaching for the security request form he knew should be there, and found an empty slot where the form packet should have been. Ranger let out a single low huff, not a bark, not a growl, just a breath that said, "Something's wrong." Haskins watched Shaw notice. Lott watched him notice. And in that small, silent exchange, Shaw learned what Ranger had been warning him about since the community hall. The problem wasn't just Carden Vale. The problem was how quickly the system moved to cover for him, and how easily paperwork could vanish in a town that smiled too easily. Shaw didn't leave the sheriff's office angry. He left precise, like a man tightening straps before a storm. He drove Ellie and her grandmother to a small interview room at the county substation. Outside Haskins's building, outside local hands. Ranger rode in the back, silent, eyes on the rear window as if he could smell trouble riding their bumper. Shaw set a recorder on the table, wrote the date and time, and asked Ellie to tell it again, slowly, in her own words. She did. Voice small, spine straight. Describing Vale's grip, the too close whisper, the warning. Halfway through, her grandmother's phone buzzed. It was Lila from the diner, breathless. "I saved something. Please don't say it was me." Minutes later, Lila slipped in through a side door, apron still on, cheeks red from the cold. She placed her phone down. "I was filming my niece," she said. But the mic caught his voice. Shaw didn't touch it with bare hands. He sealed it in an evidence bag, labeled it, then had Lila play the backup she'd emailed to herself. 2 copies, 2 locations. The audio was messy with kids singing, but Vale's low murmur cut through. "Don't be shy, and don't tell." The room went colder. Ranger's ears tipped forward, and he stared at the closed door like he expected footsteps. Lila swallowed. "That's not the first time. He always picks the quiet ones." Shaw asked, "Did anyone else record the event?" Lila hesitated. "The hall has cameras, but the principal's brother runs the system." That was the open loop, and Shaw felt it click. He drove to the hall with Ranger and pulled a maintenance export from a side terminal the janitor used, an angle the main office rarely checked. On it, Vale's hand wasn't just on Ellie's shoulder. It slid, possessive, and Ellie's twist away was clear as daylight. A second figure appeared too, one of Vale's suited men, watching the line, holding a tablet as if he were timing the moment. Shaw froze the frame, zoomed in, and saw a school staff badge clipped to the man's belt, issued under a name that didn't match any employee roster. Back at the substation, a court notice arrived by fax, already assigning a hearing date and a judge, fast-tracked like someone had pulled strings. Shaw's eyes caught the clerk's signature at the bottom. Not a pen stroke, but a stamped cursive, identical to the stamp on older filings he'd questioned years ago. Same flourish, same tilt, like one hand had been signing for the whole town. He copied the clip to an encrypted drive, then to a second drive he kept on his person, and logged every transfer in ink. Ranger kept glancing toward the window, tracking a parked sedan across the street that hadn't been there. Shaw realized the pattern. Vale hadn't stumbled onto Ellie. He'd selected her. Ellie looked up at him. "Why are they hurrying?" Shaw didn't lie. "Because they're not just trying to stop a story," he said. "They're trying to stop you." The room where Briar Hollow made its real decisions didn't look like a villain's lair. It looked like success. Mahogany table, bottled water lined up like a courtesy, framed photos of ribbon cuttings and smiling children shaking hands with men in suits. It sat above the bank's main floor, tucked behind a frosted glass door that read, Community Development Committee, a name soft enough to hide teeth. Outside, Main Street glowed with early evening lights, and the town kept acting like everything was normal. Inside, normal had been replaced by strategy. Carden Vale stood at the window with his jacket off, tie loosened, one hand braced on the sill as if he were holding the whole town in place. The charm was gone from his face, replaced by irritation that flickered into something colder whenever he remembered Ellie's voice carrying across the hall. "This is getting traction," Vale said, tapping his phone screen and turning it toward the table. A blurry clip, Ellie twisting away, adults frozen, had already found its way onto a local Facebook group. Comments piled up in righteous bursts and defensive denials. At the table sat Mayor Susan Rourke, posture perfect, lips pressed tight like she'd been chewing the word scandal all day. Next to her, Sheriff Dale Haskins shifted in his chair, heavy hands clasped. County Prosecutor Maren Lott flipped through a folder, eyes darting to certain pages like she was counting how many fires were burning at once. Two other men, outsiders with insider confidence, sat opposite. One in a crisp gray suit with a corporate pin on his lapel, the other with a tablet and a calm, expressionless face that screamed consultant. The air smelled faintly of cologne and money. "We need containment," the gray suit man said, voice smooth as glass. "Not emotion, containment." He slid a page across the table, talking points, headlines, a timeline. Damage control strategy was printed at the top. "We frame this as confusion," he continued. "A child misinterpreting a supportive gesture. We emphasize Mr. Vale's philanthropic record. We highlight the harm of false accusations. We remind people what's at stake for the town." Mayor Rourke nodded slightly, relief visible in the tiny movement. "Protect Briar Hollow," she murmured, as if the town were a fragile vase only certain hands could touch. Sheriff Haskins cleared his throat. "I told Shaw to slow down," he said, defensive. "He's a good officer, but he's stubborn." Vale turned from the window, eyes narrowing. "Stubborn is a problem," he replied. "Stubborn turns into outside oversight. Outside oversight turns into audits. Audits turn into questions we don't want asked." Prosecutor Lott lifted her gaze. "We can make the trial unpleasant without making it illegal," she said carefully. "Delay hearings, lose paperwork, request continuances. If it drags, the family might fold." The consultant finally spoke, voice flat, clinical. "We should isolate the witness," he said. "Pressure the grandmother, employers, neighbors, quiet social sanctions. If the community turns cold enough, they'll retreat." Mayor Rourke's fingers tightened around her water bottle. "We can't threaten a child," she said. But her tone didn't carry outrage. It carried calculation, like she was worried about optics, not morality. Vale gave a small laugh that held no humor. "No one is threatening a child," he said, then leaned forward and placed both hands on the table, palms down, owning the space. "We are protecting this town from chaos, from headlines, from outsiders who don't understand what we've built." His eyes flicked to the gray suit man. "What about the handler's dog? People love that kind of story." "Then we change the story," the gray suit man replied. "We paint Shaw as a grandstander, a man with a hero complex using a traumatized child for attention. We find something in his record. We get whispers going." Sheriff Haskins shifted again, discomfort creasing his face. "Mason's clean," he muttered. Lott's mouth tightened. "No one's clean if you dig deep enough," she said. "Everyone has something." The consultant tapped his tablet, and a list appeared. Ellie's school schedule, her grandmother's workplace, addresses, phone numbers. The casualness of it made the room feel colder. "We have leverage," he said. "And time." Mayor Rourke swallowed. "And if they still won't back down?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Vale stared at the list like it was a menu. Then he spoke in a tone so calm, it was worse than shouting. "Then we break the witness," he said. "Not in the courtroom, before the courtroom. Make her afraid to open her mouth. He straightened, smoothing his shirt as if the conversation were just another budget meeting. We apply pressure until the girl's family begs for this to end. The room went quiet, each person measuring their own conscience against their own fear. Then Vale looked at them one by one, eyes hard, and delivered the line like an instruction stamped into policy. "If she testifies," he said, voice low and final, "we end her family." That night, Ellie's house didn't feel like home so much as a place the dark had decided to study. And even the Christmas lights her grandmother had hung along the porch rail seemed too bright, too cheerful for what was creeping in around the edges. The little rental sat at the end of Maple Lane, where the street lamps thinned out and the trees leaned close enough to whisper, and the wind carried the dry scratch of branches against the siding like fingernails, testing a lock. Mason Shaw parked his cruiser down the block, far enough to not look like a siege, close enough to move fast, and walked Ranger up the path with the leash short. Not because he didn't trust the dog, but because he trusted him the way you trust a smoke alarm. It only screams when something is truly wrong. Inside, the house smelled like chamomile tea and laundry detergent. The kind of clean scent people cling to when they're trying to hold their lives together. Ellie sat at the kitchen table in her blue sweater, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't really drinking, eyes fixed on the front window as if it might suddenly explain the world. Her grandmother, Ms. June, moved with restless purpose, checking the deadbolt twice, pulling curtains tight, setting her phone on the counter like it was a weapon she didn't know how to use. "They wouldn't," June kept saying, half prayer, half denial. Not over words. Shaw didn't argue. He'd learned that in towns like Briar Hollow, words were the most dangerous thing you could give a child, because words turned into records, and records turned into accountability, and accountability turned powerful men into desperate men. The first call came at 8:17 p.m., an unknown number, and June answered before Shaw could stop her, because fear makes you grab at any chance to control something. Silence breathed into the line for 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate. Then a voice, disguised and flat, said, "Tell her to be smart," and hung up. June stared at the phone like it had bitten her. Ellie's fingers tightened around her mug. Shaw wrote the time down and watched Ranger, who had gone perfectly still near the doorway, ears angled toward the porch as if the sound had come from outside instead of the phone. The second call hit at 8:44, then again at 9:03. Each one a little different. One a heavy exhale and a click. One a whisper that sounded like someone smiling. One just the dead air of someone listening to prove they could. June stopped answering, but the ringing itself became its own kind of intimidation, a bell that reminded them they were being watched. Then the car arrived. It rolled down Maple Lane slow, like it wasn't sure where it was going, and stopped across the street with the engine idling, headlights off. Shaw saw the shape through the sliver in the curtain, dark sedan, tinted windows, and his body shifted into that quiet readiness that had kept people alive overseas and back home. "Stay away from the windows," he told June gently. Ellie didn't move anyway. She was frozen in a way that wasn't childish panic, but controlled, like she was trying to be small without shrinking. Ranger moved to the living room and sat, not by Ellie's chair, but between her and the front door, then turned his head toward the window and held his gaze there as if the glass had become a screen showing something only he could see. His tail didn't wag. His breathing slowed. The air in the house thickened with the hum of the refrigerator and the far-off bark of someone else's dog. And then Ranger's lip lifted just enough to show the edge of a tooth. Not aggression, not a snarl, a professional warning. Shaw's hand hovered near the leash and his radio, and he listened. The car's idle, steady as a heartbeat, 10 minutes past, 15. The car didn't move. It was there to be seen. When it finally rolled away, it didn't peel out. It drifted, casual like a neighbor heading home, and that casualness was the point. We can do this all night. June exhaled shakily, whispering, "Please?" to no one. Ellie blinked, slow, then asked in a voice that tried to sound brave, "Are we safe?" Shaw's answer was honest, but steady. "We're alert." At 10:26, June opened the door a crack to bring in the welcome mat she'd left out earlier, and something slid into view beneath it. An envelope, plain white, no stamp. Shaw stopped her with a firm hand on her wrist and crouched instead, using a pen to flip the envelope over without touching it. No name, no return address. Just 3 words written in block letters so neat they looked printed. Stop her now. June's breath broke. Ellie made a small sound in her throat, then pressed her lips together like she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of tears. Ranger leaned forward, nose hovering over the envelope, then snapped his head toward the dark window again, staring so hard it felt like the night was staring back. And in that heavy silence, with the warning on the floor and the car's memory still humming in the street, Shaw understood the backroom promise had already become action. They weren't waiting for court to scare Ellie. They were trying to teach her, right now, that telling the truth had a price. Trial morning arrived with a brittle gray sky that made Briar Hollow look washed clean on the surface, like the town was trying to pretend it hadn't spent the last 48 hours pressing its thumb into a child's life. And as Mason Shaw walked up the courthouse steps, the wind carried the metallic tang of snow that wasn't falling, and the murmur of a crowd that had come to witness either justice or silence, depending on which side of power they lived on. Ellie moved beside her grandmother in her blue sweater, chin lifted, eyes forward, and Shaw could see the effort it took for her to keep her steps even. Fear tried to tug her smaller, but dignity held her upright. Ranger stayed close at Shaw's knee, harness snug, gaze scanning faces like a camera panning a scene for threats. In the vestibule, Shaw paused long enough to check the hallway corners and the exits, then knelt slightly so Ellie could hear him over the courthouse echo. "Remember," he said softly, "you only tell what's true. Nothing else matters." Ellie nodded once, the smallest soldier's nod. Inside the courtroom, the air was dry and overheated, smelling of paper, perfume, and old varnish, and every bench was packed with people wearing their opinions like coats. Some righteous, some defensive, some simply terrified to be seen caring. Reporters sat near the aisle with phones poised. At the front, Judge Harold Wexler adjusted his glasses and shuffled papers with the crisp ritual of a man who believed order could tame anything. Shaw approached the bench before proceedings began and spoke in a tone that was polite but unbending. "Your Honor, I'm requesting permission for my K-9 to remain near the witness for support and safety," he said. "Given recent intimidation attempts." A ripple moved through the gallery. Whispers, raised brows, the faintest scoff from the defense table, while the defense attorney, a slick man with a calm smile, rose halfway as if to object on principle. Wexler held up a hand. His eyes flicked to Ellie's small frame, to June's tight grip on her purse, to Ranger sitting in perfect stillness like a statue carved from discipline. "Granted," the judge said, voice carrying. "The animal will remain under control at all times." Shaw didn't thank him with words. He thanked him with compliance, guiding Ranger forward as Ellie took her seat. And Ranger did something that made the room subtly shift. He didn't sit beside Ellie like a pet. He angled his body and placed himself deliberately between Ellie and the judge's bench, a living barrier where no one had expected one. It looked at first glance almost symbolic. Protection between a child and the weight of authority. But Shaw knew Ranger's instincts were never about symbolism. Ranger's ears turned as if catching a frequency under human hearing. The bailiff called for order. The prosecutor began gently. "Ellie, can you tell us what happened at the community hall?" Ellie swallowed, hands folded, and started to speak, voice thin but clear, the words landing like stones in water. As she described Vale's grip and the warning, Ranger stayed still, until, mid-sentence, a new scent threaded into the room with the subtlety of poison. Sharp, chemical, clean in the wrong way, like something recently handled that wasn't meant to be noticed. Ranger's head lifted an inch. His nose worked once, twice, and then his body changed. Muscles tightening under his coat, tail going rigid, ears snapping forward as his gaze locked past the witness stand toward the right side rail, where a cluster of suited men sat too close together, faces arranged into polite masks. One man, tablet in hand, stopped tapping his foot. Another's smile twitched. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't need to. He leaned forward, staring at the base of the rail, then at the underside of the witness stand, then back to the suited man like he was drawing a line between them. Shaw felt a cold, focused certainty slide into place. Ranger wasn't reacting to emotion. He was alerting to something physical, something present. Shaw's hand hovered near the harness, ready, while Ellie's voice faltered for half a beat at the sudden shift in the air. Judge Wexler noticed too. He froze mid-note, pen suspended, eyes narrowing as he watched the dog's unwavering stare. "Officer Shaw," Wexler said slowly, the first crack of unease breaking through his courtroom calm. "What is your K9 indicating?" Shaw didn't answer immediately because he was watching Wexler's face. Watching the moment the judge realized the same thing Shaw had realized the night the envelope appeared under Ellie's mat. Intimidation wasn't a rumor anymore. It had a method. It had tools. And if Ranger was smelling something now, something hidden, something placed, then the danger wasn't outside the courthouse walls at all. It was already inside the room, threaded into the very place where truth was supposed to be safe. Judge Wexler's pen hovered like it had forgotten how to fall. And in the silence that followed his question, Briar Hollow's courtroom stopped being a stage and became a trap. Everyone suddenly realized they might be standing in. Ranger held perfectly still, eyes locked on the suited man with the tablet, then flicked to the underside of the witness stand as if tracing an invisible wire. And Mason Shaw felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck, because that posture, ears forward, tail rigid, nostrils sampling, wasn't comfort behavior. It was an operational alert. "Your Honor," Shaw said, voice steady, "Ranger is trained to indicate electronic devices and chemical residue associated with concealment and tampering. He's telling me something is planted." A wave of whispers surged, then broke under the judge's sharp, unexpected command. "Bailiff," Wexler snapped, standing so fast his chair scraped, "clear the well. Do not move the witness. Officer Shaw, keep that dog exactly where he is." The defense attorney rose with outrage already loaded. "This is absurd," he began, but Wexler cut him off with a glare that carried the weight of a gavel without needing to strike it. "Sit," Wexler said, voice low and dangerous, "or I will hold you in contempt." The bailiff moved, hands out, guiding Ellie and her grandmother back a step while Shaw stepped forward, Ranger's leash short, his own eyes scanning the suited cluster at the right rail. The tablet man tried to laugh. Too light, too late. "Your Honor, this is a child-friendly support dog, not—" Ranger's head snapped toward him, and the man's voice died as if the air had been cut. Shaw crouched, following Ranger's stare to the underside of the witness stand where wood met shadow. And there, half hidden behind a bracket, was a small black puck no bigger than a coin, taped in place with fresh adhesive that gleamed under the courtroom lights. A transmitter. A live microphone. The room inhaled as one. Wexler's face drained of color, then hardened into something older than surprise. Recognition. "Get it," Shaw said quietly, and the bailiff, hands shaking, produced gloves from a drawer like he'd been praying he'd never need them. The device came away with a soft rip, and the moment it cleared the wood, a faint red light blinked, mocking. "Who authorized surveillance in my courtroom?" Wexler demanded, voice cracking like a whip, and his eyes found Sheriff Haskins seated behind the prosecution table, because Haskins had insisted on being present as a sign of community concern. Haskins' folksy smile tried to appear, then failed. "Now, Harold, he started. But Wexler slammed his palm down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the old room. "Do not herald me," Wexler said. "Answer." The prosecutor, Marin Lott, shifted in her seat, lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. And Vale, sitting in the back row, perfectly composed, didn't move at all, because men like him were trained to look untouched by chaos. Ranger, however, had never been trained to respect optics. His gaze moved from the device to Vale, and a low, controlled growl rolled out of his chest, not loud, but loud enough to turn every head in the gallery toward the man the town had been protecting. Vale's eyes narrowed for half a second, then widened into practiced innocence. "This is outrageous," he said smoothly. "I'm as shocked as anyone." The stun of it, the proof, the brazenness, hit the courtroom like a wave, and then another voice cut through from the side door, trembling but clear. "Your Honor," someone said. A woman stepped forward from the clerk's area, clutching a manila envelope to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. It was the records clerk, the one who'd said she was out of carbon copies, the one whose eyes had begged Shaw not to make her choose. Her hands shook so badly the envelope rattled. I can't do this anymore," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word. Every face turned toward her, and in that instant, you could see the war inside her. Fear of power versus fear of her own conscience. She swallowed hard and raised the envelope. "These are the documents they told me to stamp," she said, voice growing steadier with each syllable. "Continuances, dismissals, signed orders that never went before the judge. They gave me a stamp with a fake signature." She looked straight at Vale then, tears shining, but not falling. "He gave it to me." Vale's smile vanished. "That's a lie," he said. But it sounded thin now, a suit jacket over a rotten core. The clerk thrust the envelope toward the bailiff. "And there's more," she said quickly, as if speed could outrun consequences. "There's a flash drive, audio from the back room upstairs at the bank. I was supposed to delete it, but I didn't." Gasps rippled. Wexler's eyes flared. "Bring it," he ordered. Shaw's heart hammered once, not from fear, but from the sudden shift. This was the insider break, the turning of the tide. The clerk's voice dropped into a whisper as she handed over the drive. They said if she testifies, they end her family." The line landed like ice. For a beat, no one moved. Then Wexler's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He looked at Shaw. "Officer," he said, voice controlled. "Call the state. Now." Shaw didn't need a second instruction. He already had his phone out, already dialing the number he'd kept ready for exactly this moment. the uncorrupted layer above the town's closed loop. Within minutes, the courthouse doors opened again, and the sound that followed wasn't the murmur of gossip. It was the heavy, purposeful footfall of outside authority. State investigators in plain clothes. An agent with a badge that didn't belong to Briar Hollow. A technician carrying an evidence case. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, because power had shifted away from the men who'd been hoarding it. Sheriff Haskins stood, trying to reclaim control with bluster. "Now hold on," he protested. "This is my jurisdiction." The lead investigator didn't even raise his voice. "Sheriff Dale Haskins," he said, "you are being detained pending investigation into obstruction, witness intimidation, and unlawful surveillance." The word detained hit like a hammer. Haskins' face turned mottled, and his hands lifted in reflex. The bailiff moved. Handcuffs clicked. One domino fell. Prosecutor Lott rose, eyes darting to the exits, but the investigator's gaze pinned her. "Marin Lott," he said, "do not leave." Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time she looked less like an authority figure and more like a person realizing the ground beneath her was breaking. Another domino leaned. Vale stayed seated, spine straight, as if stillness could make him untouchable. But Ranger's growl returned, low, unwavering, and Shaw stepped slightly so his body blocked Ellie's view of the back row, because a child didn't need to watch justice, coming like a wave. The lead investigator turned to Vale. "Carden Vale," he said, "we have evidence of attempted witness intimidation, tampering with court proceedings, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." Vale finally stood, smile flickering back like a dying bulb. "This is a misunderstanding," he began, those same words the town loved. But the investigator's hand was already out. "Turn around," he said. Vale's eyes flashed. Rage, calculation, disbelief that the script was changing, and then his wrists were cuffed in front of everyone who had once applauded him at the community hall. The gallery erupted, not with cheers at first, but with a stunned, breathless sound, like a spell snapping. Cameras flashed. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," as if they'd just realized the monster was real. Ellie sat very still, blue sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, and Shaw knelt close enough that she could hear him without the room hearing. "You did the right thing," he said. Her eyes filled, but her chin stayed up. Ranger shifted then, moving back into his earlier position, settling between Ellie and the bench like a guardian returning to post. And Wexler watched the dog with something like reverence now. Not because Ranger was a symbol, but because Ranger had been the first honest thing in the room. The justice sequence rolled fast after that. Search warrants signed by a judge who now knew he'd been used. Investigators sweeping the bank's upstairs committee room, technicians pulling transcripts and device logs. Deputies who'd been complicit, suddenly silent as their phones were taken and their stories demanded. Outside on the courthouse steps, the same townspeople who'd once smiled too easily stood with hands over mouths, watching men in suits escorted into vehicles, watching power hauled out into daylight. By afternoon, news vans lined Main Street. By evening, the mayor resigned in a statement that sounded like someone reading a script they didn't believe. And in the quieter aftermath, when the town's decorations still blinked and the bakery still smelled like cinnamon, Ellie went home with state protection in place. Locks changed, numbers swapped. A plan that didn't rely on Briar Hollow's goodwill. Shaw stood on her porch as the sky softened into dusk, and Ranger sat beside him, finally allowing his tail a slow, calm sweep against the wood. Relief, not celebration. June Carson stepped out, eyes red, voice raw. "Thank you," she said. and the words were too small for what had been saved. Shaw nodded once. "You thanked the wrong people," he replied, glancing toward Ellie in the doorway. Ellie looked back, small and steady. Ranger's gaze followed hers, gentle now. In the weeks that followed, the town began the hard work it had avoided for years. People speaking, records audited, new officials appointed, apologies that didn't erase harm, but started repair. And one photo, Ranger sitting between a little girl and a judge, spread everywhere, not as a gimmick, but as a reminder that courage sometimes has 4 paws and a quiet growl, and that a child's truth, backed by steadfast protection, can make even a town built on silence finally, at last, learn to listen.